Okay, hello. There is a new version of Overmind coming up, but there's a thing blocking the release currently, and that is parallel state charts. And I have actually implemented a version of it, but it started like bringing up all these thoughts on how to express this stuff, and I got some feedback. I thought I would kind of like explain the challenge with this, because I'm very dedicated to making a great typing experience. In general, that is more problematic when you want to create an API. Usually it ends up in a better API, because you don't just go to the first API you think of. You have to, it's just more limited what kinds of APIs you can create. Anyways, so what we have here is just a simple state chart configuration where I have some state and actions, and then I wrap it with a download chart. And the download chart is, I'm not using typing here. We are going to talk about typing, but I don't want to, like, it's more verbose. So, and I'm lazy. So I have a download state chart here, which has an idle state, a loading state, and an error state. And yeah, based on actions, download, resolve, download, etc., it changes these states. And then I've added this to our state chart, and nothing crazy about this. Now the thing is that if let's see, we can just play around with it here. If we write a component, we want to know what state our state chart is in. So currently we have these matches API where you can pass in a state. So in this case, I'm passing in idle. And since the chart starts in its idle state, that will be true. So that means you can, like, if Overmind state matches idle, do this kind of thing. Now the problem is that this isn't typed, so you wouldn't get any suggestions here. It wouldn't verify that you're pointing to actual states in the chart, and that is not because it's impossible to type this. It would actually be very easy to type this. The problem is when we start getting into nested charts and also parallel charts. So initially this was typed, but then we had nested charts, which means that, okay, on so when we're in idle state, you can also upload, for example. Let's see, upload. Yeah, this doesn't really work, but you understand the concept here. So we have like a nested chart of upload. And now this has its own set of states. So when we go back here now, like how would we express that you're in idle loading, for example? Well, the way you would do that now, you say idle loading, but this, again, this isn't typed because this becomes dynamic in nature, meaning that if the download changes to loading, then it's not valid to pass in any idle loading or error state for the upload because it's not active anymore. So then you won't be able to type that. You wouldn't know that if it's in loading state here, that you can't pass in something here. Yes, and it doesn't get any easier when we add parallel charts. So the way I added parallel charts was to do download and upload. Now we have two different charts, and they're running in parallel. The question is now, how do we know the state of the chart itself when we have these two? And the point is that you don't want to know the whole state of the chart. You want to know if a specific path is up and running. So for example, if we were to do matches idle here, that would currently return true because the download is in idle state. But the problem is that our upload also has an idle state. It has the same name. So which one of them is idle? You don't know that. So in parallel charts, it's you don't have any way to express the uniqueness of a chart. So then we started discussing this, and one thing that, for example, Xchart does is having an ID. So you would kind of like say ID equals download, and ID here would be upload. Okay, so that's possible to do, but then you kind of like you do two different things inside your matches. You do like, okay, so the first one should be download, which is an ID, and then the next one is idle, which is a state, and then if you were doing something nested, you would again have to do ID, so you would kind of like alternate ID and a state. And so that's one thing. I think that's a little bit weird. Another thing is that you define the ID on the chart itself. In this case, we have an explicit download and upload. But what if you wanted multiple downloads instead? Okay, I want to be able to run 3 different downloads. How would you differentiate them? They all now have the same ID. Well, you would have to like create a factory and say foo bar to kind of like give it the ID. That would work. But then this becomes much more difficult related to typing. And also like just this, not possible to type this. So yeah. So what can we do instead? So I have a suggestion here. It's a breaking change, but I think it's necessary to make a more consistent API. It also makes the API a tiny bit more verbose. But at the same time, I think it is way more explicit. And that's the thing about state charts. The structure becomes quite nested, like multiple levels deep. But yeah, let me show you what I mean here. So instead of having a factory, of course, we will not have an ID on any of this. So what we would do here instead of having an array here, we have an object, and it's always an object. So even if you only have one single chart, you will have to write it like this. And this is also a thing like with Xstate, like the API is good, but I don't like about some parts of it is that it's very dynamic in nature. Like you can make maybe I can find the documentation here. Let's see if I can find it. Guides, hierarchical state nodes. So in one example, where was this? Was it in parallel? I don't quite remember. Maybe I can just explain it instead. I think it's in hierarchical. Yeah, so here you have, so the pedestrian states is like inlined with the red state, but you would also be able to, I don't know where the example is, but you would also be able to use pedestrian states directly on the red state, I believe. So my point is that there are different versions at the same level of the API. So a state can be expressed as this, or it can be expressed as just a single chart. And those kinds of dynamic natures in an API, I don't personally like that, because it's all about reducing syntax instead of having a coherent API. Shout at me if I was wrong about the Xstate API there. But anyways, so I don't want, like if you have a single chart, you should be able to pass in that single chart. But if you have multiple parallel charts, then suddenly this object means something else. I don't want that. So what we're going to do is rather have an object where we say download and upload. And now, what happened now? Let's go back here. Oops. What happened now is that we actually gave IDs to these. So we say that, okay, we have this chart here. We want to call it download, and it just happens to be named download as well. And that means that if I wanted to add another download chart here, I could say download 2 also equals download, for example. And now the ID becomes a part of the structure, and this opens up some stuff for us. So instead of having a matches API like this, we could rather expose the chart itself. So the chart would actually reflect the structure here, everything here, except the configuration itself. It will kind of like reflect the same structure, but only related to state. So an example of that would be, okay, I want to know this if the download state is idle. I would say Overmind Statecharts download, which would be, maybe I can write this with, so it becomes a bit more. So download, and then I want to point to its idle state. Yes, and I believe this is enough. Idle. Yeah, because the problem here is that, okay, you can see my confusion now, and this is the tricky part with this API, because now we are making it type safe, because we know that we have a download, we know that we have an idle state, and now we're kind of like checking, so this would be true, okay? And then we would do the same for download 2, we could check if that is idle, or for example, loading, and the same for upload. Idle true, for example. Now the thing is, that means that this chart object would look something like this. So we had download, idle true, download 2, idle false, loading true. Yeah, so let's see, loading false, error false. So the point is that even though this state has multiple, it expresses multiple states, it's a derived state. So this is not something you would manipulate. This is something the state chart gives you, so that you can easily go in your components and figure out what is the state of the different charts. Yes, but then we have nested, and I actually don't quite remember how I wanted to do this, because now if the idle state has a nested chart, you would have to do something like this. So idle, and it has a different chart here. Maybe it has like an, okay, I'm just going to call it foo. Which is a chart with its own states. State A, true, state B, false, for example. Now the problem is, now idle will always be true, because it's always an object. So the question is, should this structure be dynamic? So it doesn't keep like these parts, because those aren't active. But the problem with that is that from an API perspective, if you weren't in the idle state, but you wanted to point to it, so for example, you wanted to know if the Overmind State.chart download idle foo state A, you wanted to know if this one's active. But if this state thing in here was dynamic, which means that in loading it would just say true, now this would just break, because idle foo isn't there. You would get like an undefined error. So that's kind of like the tricky part here. If we're going to show all the states all the time, that is actually quite nice as well, because it would be part of the DevTools. And as I said, it's a derived state, so it's not like you are changing these states. This is just reflecting the state of the chart. But the problem is this idle, if you want to check idle. So that means that we could... I don't really know how to fix this, because you could say like is active, and then have like true false there, but then you couldn't have the other nested charts directly underneath it. Then you would have to like say charts, for example. Here again, foo, and so on. And then in your components, you have to say is active, loading is active, idle is active. And then if you wanted to check something nested, you would say idle charts foo state A is active. It starts to get pretty hairy. But this is, the thing is that this is a type of structure that can be typed. And also it introduces this ID system, which is part of, where were we? Yeah, sorry, here. This ID system, which is part of the structure itself, which is a really good thing. So yeah, I hope I explained this okay. Please give feedback on this. And I hope it made sense. Okay, thanks, bye bye.